Fog lay like old wool across the bogs, muffling the world to breath and drip and the splashing tread of a white dire wolf. Jon Snow stood upon the broken crown of a tower that was more stump than spire, set his glove to the slick black stone, and felt the cold presence of it. Ancient, older than Winterfell's first walls, older than any tale told truly by maester or singer. Moat Cailin had been a fortress once. Now it was an accusation, half-sunken and watchful. The last obstinate teeth of the first men gnawing at a passage so narrow that all armies had to file through a throat of mud and poison water. Ghost's fur held the wet as hoarfrost holds a winter leaf. He whined softly, crimson eyes fixed upon the marshes where reeds swayed like the beard of a drowned god. Jon rubbed the wolf's neck and watched the light leach upward over the neck with funereal patience. "How old do you think?" he asked, and his voice did not carry far in the fog. "As old as the story of men." The answer came from behind him, quiet as a whisper through rushes. Howland Reed wore leather mottled with greens and blacks that turned him to a smear of shadow and riverweed. He had arrived like mist and stood like a stump that had always been there, and Jon had never learned how to hear him coming. "Or older than that, if you believe the stones remember." "I believe they remember." Jon turned. "Not words. Weight and blood." Howland stepped up beside him and watched the fog be made into morning. His face belonged to the marsh. Narrow, lined by wind and water, not old so much as weathered. Men think this place hates them. It does not. It simply remembers itself. "And will it remember wharves and cranes?" Jon asked. "Halls above the water, long quays to gather trade? A harbor in the heart of the neck. For that it will ask a price." Howland's straight brown hair was damp, stringing down like wet rushes. "Everything that lives here asks a price." "I know." Jon nodded to the east, where the marsh lapped into brackish creeks that tasted out toward the bight. "It can't only be a choke. We must make it a throat that swallows and feeds. The North needs a place that is no one's and everyone's. A free port, a haven, a pledge. Bring what you will, leave as you please." "The neck is no friend to crowds," Howland said. "Nor am I." Jon smiled despite himself, a quick, bleak curl of a mouth more practiced with grim than glad. "But here we are. The lords speak of coin. Winter has taken every oath but hunger." Howland's eyes creased at the corner. "You would bargain with bogs and spirits and men with longer purses than patience. You would do it standing upon stones that remember blood. It is a bold thing." He knelt and placed a palm on the tower's cold face. "Bolder than kings' wars. I'm not a king. Legends are made from what men call you after you're gone." Howland glanced up. "But we should set aside songs and speak of channels." They spoke there in the damp, with Ghost watching and the fog unraveling to show the marsh's mottled sheen. Howland had maps that were not ink on parchment but memory and tide, spoken under breath while a reed pipe of a lad paddled a hide boat through shallows to show the narrow ways between bar and mud, where a longship might lie, where a cog would keel over and sink its cargo to the black belly of the neck. There were islands of firm ground beneath the bog, old stone like knuckles punching up through peat, on which a pier might be pinned. There were channels that slid under a skin of duckweed, broad as any river once the weed was cleared. There were places the water worsened to fever in summer, thin as breath in winter. "The people who know these paths are the ones who have kept the North safe when your walls were far away and proud," Howland said. "If you wish to live here and change it, you will need to be adopted. By the Cranach men? By the marsh." And Howland smiled then, a quick fox smile. "But yes, my people love this quiet. They are not fond of clamor or markets or coin shouted across counters. I will bring them to your fire, and ask them to help you place your stones so they burden the water least." "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." Howland Reed rose, the water winking down his boots. "There are others who will take offense. Houses who eat from the sea and have grown fat from it. Men who will see what you propose as a hand snatched into their purse." "Wyman Manderley," Jon said. "And not only him. White Harbor takes tolls and watches the east with old jealous eyes. Lannisport will hear a whisper that coin might go north and wonder who has been whispering. Sigurd too, and the sisters, who are less kin to law than they are to wind and want. But White Harbor is nearest and proudest. Tell him he gains, not loses. Invite him to be your arm, not your rival. I will, Jon said. He looked out over the black water and saw markets where none stood, cranes like a forest of iron fingers, a line of warehouses on pilings, long halls open to the air where wood smoke and fish and foreign spices argued. He saw men and women standing under banners that did not measure blood, only barter. The picture warmed him strangely, as a hearth warms hands that forget they shake. Ghost put his nose up to scent the wind. The wolf's hackles rose, though the fog kept secrets. We're not alone, Jon said. We are never alone here. Howland's gaze flicked to a tangle of reeds. There was a rippling there, and out of it slid a girl in a brown cloak that shed water like a reed's skin. Mira Reed smiled at Jon with a grin that could have been a torch under a hood. You sound like your father. I have two of them if the songs are true, Jon said, keeping his voice easy. They're not songs, Mira said. They're truths hidden under moss. It is how we keep them alive. But for now, we keep you alive. She drew an arrow from a quiver at her hip. Men have been watching your camp from the sedge. The hay smell of river mud and horse and a sour ale I cannot name. Fry, Howland said. He did not spit. He was too courteous for that. But the word itself seemed to leave a film. Jon slid a hand to Longclaw's pommel. The Valyrian steel's pommel was set with a pale stone glassed like an eye, and his grip found it without looking. A dozen with mounts? He asked. 5 on foot, 2 on horses that do not like this place. Mira's voice had the light play of a laugh somewhere beneath it, but there was nothing playful in her eyes. They stand as men stand who do not want to die but fear a lash more than a white. They'll be ghosts soon enough if they step wrong, Howland murmured. The neck is patient. Bring them in, Jon said. Gently. Ask them to warm themselves and eat. Let them tell me who sent them. They will not talk, Mira said. They never do, Howland agreed. Then they can listen. Jon glanced to Ghost. Guard. The wolf vanished like a white secret into the gauze of morning, and Jon felt calmer for knowing there was nothing in that fog Ghost would not taste before it found him. He drew a slow breath anyway, and let it out as if it were smoke he did not need. You will need more than wolves and reeds to make a port, Howland said. You will need a charter. I will have one. Jon's mouth tightened. Stark laws are old as the first oath sworn to a heart tree, but the men who come over water don't follow them. They follow coin and custom and the law of their hull. I must speak that law as if I were born with salt on my tongue. Find those who were, Howland said simply. I mean to. He meant Davos Seaworth if he could be found. He meant Tycho Nestoris of the Iron Bank, whose quill had once made kings stumble. He meant any shipman who had lived long enough to be honest about smuggling. And he meant to invite Wyman Manderley to sit on a seat that let him watch the gold weigh and the grain flow, so White Harbor's fear could be bound to this cause instead of set against it. The fog lifted by inches. The old stones of Moat Cailin sweated in it and seemed to weep. He could see men moving along the broken walls. Northmen, freed wildlings, gray little crannogmen, winter-thin small folk hired in with the promise of hot stew and coppers. They sawed and hammered, they hauled brush for fire, they laughed with mist in their hair though they had little to laugh about. Jon watched them and felt a heat he had not felt when men shouted his name in a hall. I will need timber for pilings, he said. Stone for a causeway that won't sink. Cunning for locks and sluices so that the channels keep their water when the tide forgets them. You will need patience, Howland said, which is more expensive than stone. Jon smiled with half his mouth again. You will help. You asked me, Howland said. That was the price. When the fry men were brought in, not roughly, but wet to the waist with the sweet stench of marsh clinging to them, they had their hands empty and their eyes loud. Jon sat them by a fire and shared a trencher and listened to the nothing their mouths said and the way their eyes kept sliding toward the causeway. He saw fear and unbelief and a kind of sour contempt, as if this mire had no right to be proud. He let them see his wolf sleeping with one red eye open and made no threat with it. He told them he would build a hall where no lord had ever dared a hall, a fair place where a man's name mattered less than his good faith. He made it sound simple as caulking a seam. "Tell your lord what you saw," Jon finished. "Tell him this is coming. He can come and spit in the water if it pleases him. The marsh will drink it." They looked at him as if he had told them he would build a castle on wind. His eyes were green as old pewter and twice as hard. He made his bow with every courtesy owed a lord of Winterfell, and then he made the hall feel as if it had been built for him after all. "It is finer to build. Lord Manderly." Jon came to him. Him. A silence made from memory of songs walked with Wyman Manderly wherever he went now, and it smelled faintly of gravy. "You honor us, and you honor your name." Wyman lifted a hand like a dinner plate and let it fall again, captive to wait. "We have felt the teeth of winter. The coast has no small appetite either. You would feed both with a mouth in the marsh. Very well. How do you keep it from drowning?" Howland Reed stepped from a beam's shadow as if men grew like mushrooms in Winterfell's old wood. The Manderly men who had come to stand behind their lord started to spite themselves. Howland came to the circle around the hearth as if he had been invited, and Jon saw Sansa's eyes sharpen with curiosity rather than offense. Courtesies were edgy as ice around Howland even here. It was not that he was rude. It was that he belonged to a part of the north that did not bow to men, only to trees. "By asking the water where it wants to go," Howland said. "And then building where it told you not to," Wyman rumbled, amused. "Lord Reed, is it? I've not had your company at White Harbor, though I hear your men often enough in the fog. I prefer to visit with the wind." Howland's smile was all ripple. "I will visit with you if it pleases you, when the marsh permits it. Do so. White Harbor is very welcoming." There was a ghost of a grin under Wyman's white bristle of mustache. "We have kitchens that have adopted grown men." Laughter went around and let everyone breathe. Jon felt Sansa's look. "Now," he nodded. "I am not asking to take aught from White Harbor's plate," Jon said. "I am asking the White Knife to feed the North and the marsh to feed it too. I ask House Manderly to be steward of the free port, to build the docks and teach the cranes to lift, to show my marshmen how to make water work for them. Any ship that floats can come to the moat for the price of honesty. Toll no man, tax no cargo. Let all the counting be in open ledger and witnessed by a circle of houses, not just Stark and Manderly and Reed, but Glover and Mormont and Umber and Serwyn, with a wildling chosen by his people and a sisterman if he can be trusted not to spit in the stew. The rules are written on one board plain enough for any man to read, and they are these: no slavers, no slingshots at customers, no thieving, and the law follows the goods home on the road if they're stolen. The customs are written this way: the harbor is free. The warehouses are rented for coin that goes to the port's keep. We use that coin to pay watchmen and wardens, and to mind the beacon lights. The marsh is not to be cut without a reed's say or a craftsman's hand that knows it. The stones are to be set so that they sink least. The first traders to come will get the cheapest rents, and the first offense will get a warning shouted in every tavern. The second offense will get a man thrown out by his ears. The third offense is the marsh. It has a long memory. The roar of men inside their own thoughts was louder than the fire. Wyman Manderly leaned back in his chair, his lips working side to side as if tasting. "No tolls," he said at last. "That is a hard thing for a city. It is a sweet thing for a shipman. There will be dock fees as any harbor has," Jon said. "Not to burden, only to keep the fires lit and the wharves mended. And all accounts kept so a man can see with his eyes where his coin went. The free port belongs to its water and the people who are brave enough to use it. Not to me. You would stop me taking my due?" Wyman's eyes cooled. His men behind him had stiffened before he did. They smelled storms over flats long before their lord's keel turned. "White Harbor is the North's harbor and has been since my grandfathers moved there with the wolves' good leave. We feed the North and we feed your halls. You propose to build another mouth to eat what we pull." "I propose to share the food," Jon said. I offer White Harbor the contract to build the first 3 docks and the right to run them for 7 years. I offer you the hiring of 3 masters to teach the marsh lads what they don't know of ships and keepers and keelsons. I offer a seat for your house on the circle that governs the port, with the right to call any ledger open in the hall and read it there. And I offer you what the sea offers every man who is not greedy. More if there is more to be had. More. Wyman rolled the word around. We always want more. Sansa raised her cup. My Lord Manderley, she said, music in her voice that smoothed every roughness. Would it not be an entertaining thing to say we have 2 harbors in the snow and the south has 1 in its fog? Winterfell has little to boast of that is not old. Let us boast of something new and make the south blink. That pleased him. Wyman's mouth made a smile like a crack in a pie's crust. You argue prettily, he said. I do not trust pretty. I trust numbers and ships and men who went to sea when they were boys. I will bring shipwrights to look at your marsh. I will bring men who have built upon worse. Bring men with room in their heads for reeds, Howland Reed said. If you bring men who think mud is an insult, mud will answer. Then I shall bring cooks. Wyman's eyes twinkled. Mud does not scare them. The hall laughed. Jon did not. He looked at faces, weighing not their mirth but the tightness around it, and found what he had expected. Hunger and pride and fear, all braided into one cord. He felt Sansa's gaze on him again and did not turn to it. To look would be to show the thread he was pulling. He sent crows with his terms, and a raven with another kind of letter to a man who would not come to Winterfell without being asked by name. He sent others to the 3 Sisters and to Seaguard and to a salt-stung town where he had heard there were Ibbenese whalers who kept their coin in bone boxes. Then he returned to the marsh and worked. He learned to hammer pilings into mud by listening to men, whose fathers had hammered lodge poles the same way for generations. He learned to read water by smell, to know when a skin of green was only green and when it had the hidden muscle of a deep channel beneath it. He learned that a man's weight could be a friend or an enemy depending on how gently he set it down. He judged disputes over fish and over ale that was too weak by custom, and over whether a marsh child might sell eels in a stall with men whose fathers had been men of Winterfell for 100 years. He set men to hewing a raised road over the worst of the sucking ground so carts could come slowly and not be eaten. He set others to knotting brush and laying it and knotting more, building the road out of woven stick and stone until it held like a basket holds grain. He sat up in a tent at night with Howland Reed and 2 old marshmen whose ears were tattered as a cat's and figured how you might build a lock gate that would keep water when the tide slunk away. He dreamed of drowning almost every night and woke with ghost's breath on his face, hot and honest. Then men came as crows were tied to go and crows came with replies. Davos Seaworth limped into the marsh with an old cloak that could have been a sail, a grin that cut his face in half, and a story for how the world had ended twice and no one had noticed because the stew kept boiling. He took one look at the place and gave a laugh like Enor biting water. You want to make a harbor out of stubborn, Davos said. I've sailed in worse waters. Give me a plank and something heavy to hold the other side, and I'll show your lads how to make a quay talk. Talk? Mira asked, delighted. Aye. Davos winked at her. Everything talks if you've lived long enough to listen. Tycho Nestoris came with a cloak edged in seal fur and a nose that looked as if it had fought with cold and won. He carried a ledger and a quill that made men straighten their shirts as if an ink stain could cost them a finger. He stood on a wet plank and did not complain overmuch when the plank sank an inch because a man who lives by figures knows that swearing is a coin you should not spend where there is no return. The Iron Bank invests when there is profit, Tycho said, but it invests more securely when there is law. I have read your draft. He lifted the parchment that had cost Jon more sleep than the locks. I have added 2 clauses and struck one. See here. A ship whose master declares a cargo inaccurately cannot return within a year and a day. And here, slavers who land are seized. Their cargo, he let that word hang in the air like a dead thing, is freed. Their ship is taken into ward. Their crew is fined a sum not less than the value of the ship. And the coin that comes from that is used to feed the free. Agreed, Jon said at once. Tycho blinked, impressed despite himself. You are either foolishly moral or unsentimentally hungry. Both suit the bank when they do not trip the numbers. What clause did you strike? Sansa had appeared like draft at Jon's shoulder, the light catching in her hair as if it had been braided with frost. She had chosen to come to the marsh when the crows told how many men were here who'd never knelt to Starks in any hall. She had walked across brush roads with a poise that made marshes kneel back. The one that declares the port sanctified and inviolable, Tycho said. Law cannot sanctify, it can only punish. Then we will keep the words and remove the word sanctify, Sansa said, smiling. We will call the port a refuge for honest trade, and we will declare the punishments plainly for those who do not honor that refuge. Men love the word refuge. They love not freezing to death more, Davos put in. Do you know what is better than a sanctified port? A bowl of fish stew that takes the frost out of your knuckles. Lord Seaworth, Jon said. You are the only man I know who can make law and stew sound like cousins. They are. Davos winked. Both stick better if they simmer long with bones. They simmered. The first dock went up crooked, and Davos made them tear it down and start again. The second went up square and held against a gale that came moaning in from the east like a widow. They built the third from heavy planks cut in White Harbor by a carpenter who cursed reeds nightly and fell asleep with a smile. The first lock gate took 3 times as long as it should have and would have taken 5 if Howland Reed had not known which water to speak to with a prayer and which to hammer into obedience. And people came. A long ship with its dragon prow cut down circled in the channel at a cautious distance and fled when arrows hissed out from the rushes like water snakes. A week later another came, this time with a white rag tied to its mast. A sisterman's skin boat with a stitched hull sat rocking at a new quay, its men looking offended at how clean everything was and then offended to be grateful. A flat-bottomed Bravosi trader slid into the channel like a cat under a fence and took on fresh eels and timber planks and left bolts of sailcloth fine enough to make the marsh look up. A man with Ibonese eyebrows piled furs that smelled of whale on a wheeled barrow and haggled with a tall free folk woman for a fishbone comb in a way that left them both smiling their teeth. Jon signed the first charter with his name and then pressed a seal into wax that showed the head of a wolf but not the Stark crown. He stood clotted with mud up to his knees and read the charter aloud in a voice that made even the jeering men at the back quiet. He saw something like relief pass through faces, as if these rules made the world make sense again for a breath. Ghost walked beside him always. Men tried not to stare. Children didn't try. Mira laughed at them and stooped to let small hands feel the world's softest fur. And Ghost tolerated more than he would have from any grown man except Jon. Trouble came as it always came, braided. Through good. A Fry Sellsword with a finger missing fought another man with a knife over a barrel of salt fish and bled out on a plank. And men muttered that the marsh would never take the taste out. A Manderley foreman grumbled at a Reed waterman and the waterman shoved him into the shallows and the foreman came up with leeches stuck to him like coins, which he thought a jest and the waterman did not. 3 sacks of barley went missing and turned up in a tent that had been empty an hour before. Someone whittled a lie into the charter board and Howland had it planed smooth again by dawn and the board hung higher. And other trouble came. A whisper that something had stirred beneath one of the sinking towers. A cold that rose up in the fog and made breath come hard. A boat found empty and tied neatly as if its owner had waited to be relieved of himself. Old women shook their heads and talked of marsh lights that lured and a debt the water had been patient about collecting. Jon walked the fog and did not sleep. Ghost returned with reeds in his fur and a taste of something on his muzzle that made him sneeze. Jon scrubbed the wolf's nose with a wet rag until Ghost yawned his long pink yawn and lay down, offended. You promised the marsh, Mira said when they stood where the ground felt like a palm under the foot. It will make you pay. I promised men, Jon said. The tiredness had him by the belt and he wore it the way he wore a sword. But I will pay the marsh too. Best to pay in respect, Howland said. We have done. We will do more. We do not cut where it keeps its children. We do not burn where it keeps its food. The marsh will learn the shape of our presence and make room for it if we are not greedy. But keep your men from boasting. That is an offering the marsh will not take. The wind brought them a smell of tar and pitch and fish and a whiff of something spicy from the Bravosi patch under the tent ridge. It brought another scent too. One ghost growled at iron. The Ironborn came at low tide, when the water pulled back to show its black belly and the channels were their deepest. They came with longships that knew the feel of shallows and men with oars that had learned patience in calm and violence in storm. They came with axes bright as hunger and round shields painted with the memory of the drowned god. They also came under a flag of parley nailed with honest nails to a spar. Jon met them in a hall that had been built on pilings hammered into firm ground and had a floor that did not complain. The hall smelled of resin and eel stew and new oaths. Davos put a bowl on the table anyway, because it would only help. Asha Greyjoy walked in like the water had made her and the wind had trimmed her. She looked at the charters on the wall and snorted in a way that might have been a laugh if it had found any merriment to feed it. The man at her shoulder was narrow-cheeked and watchful and wore his sword as if it were just another limb. Carl the Maid, men had called him. He smiled like a man who did not want to tell his secrets because he liked them too much. "I could burn this place in a night," Asha said without politeness. "Light the marsh in 20 places and watch you scramble." "You could," Jon said before anyone else found a southern courtesy for rudeness. "How many of your men drowned doing it?" She looked at him darkly. "Fewer than you think. More than I want. And the marsh will burn back," Mira said pleasantly from the end of the board. "It burns slow and black and it stinks. You can ask the crows how they like to fly in that. And you must ask the marsh how it likes to taste the men who lit it." Asha's eyes moved to Mira and for the first time she smiled properly. "I would rather not." "Then talk," Davos said. "Talking is cheap as fish bones." "You have a tongue like a hook, Onion Knight," Asha said. "You catch more with it than you should." "That is what Stannis said," Davos said fondly, and Asha gave a bark that might have been grief and might have been mirth. "We don't keep slavers," Jon said. "But neither do we bar Ironborn. We bar thieves. If your men come to trade, they trade under the same rules as any sisterman or wolf or whaler." "We pay nothing," Asha said, wary. "We tithe to the drowned god by not drowning. We do not owe answer to men who bend their knee to trees." "You have a king who breaks other men's laws when he finds them inconvenient," Jon said mildly. He lifted his eyes from the table to hers. "This place has a law written on wood a man can touch with his hand, not a god's whim. You want to use it, you follow it." "You speak as if you're the one that writes the sea," Asha said. "No," Jon said. "I speak as if I have learned to listen." "That is new," Asha said dryly. "For a Stark." "I'm a Snow," Jon said, "with a Stark for a sister." Sansa lifted her chin slightly and gave Asha a nod that would have made any lord of the Iron Islands blink. Asha blinked. Then she laughed. "If your rules are not an insult to my god and not a trap for my men," she said, "we may take your coin as we take any man's who cannot defend it." "You take coin and give goods," Davos said. "We all end up fed. It's a better god's will than most." They ate eel stew. Carl the Maid asked, very interested, how the locks worked. Davos told him, very interested, how little they could be troubled by axes if men were clever in building. Howland Reed showed Asha a channel no one else had seen. She took it into her head that the marsh was not unlike the sea and liked secrets too. She stood with Jon by the charter board and said, "If your law is fair, Northmen, fair for men who wear drowned god's salt as in their hair, as you wear your wolf on your cloak, I'll sign with an X to say my crew will follow it when they come. If it is not, I will not burn your marsh. I will let it be stolen instead." "That is your courtesy?" Sansa asked, amused. "I do not pretend a better one, as I said. You can write that in your charter too. The Ironborn do not pretend." "It would be a mercy if you did," Mira murmured, but she was smiling and Asha heard kindness in it. White Harbor's men came and went with a discipline that looked careless. They built and took measures and shook their heads where the Marsh's children told them to shake them and smiled that tight builder's smile that hides panic when they learn something new. Wyman Manderley came once to stand on a platform and look down at the rail-less edge as if he had come to the lip of a pie, he had been told he could not eat. He frowned at the lock. He frowned at the ledger. He frowned at the water and at Howland Reed, who smiled and said nothing. He frowned at Jon most and then broke into a grin that made his face look like bread being torn. "This is a madman's work," he said, "and better than any sermon. Very well. White Harbor will invest 20 ships in the first season and 3 masters to teach. We will open our yards to your craftsmen to learn the building of riverboats and the trimming of reeds that do not choke the channel. We will take back from you men who learn quickest to make White Harbor better. In time you will make White Harbor poorer and the North richer. I cannot forgive you that." "I did not ask forgiveness," Jon said. "I know." Wyman patted his arm with a hand as heavy as a ham. "You are a better man than your name suggests." "Which name?" Jon asked softly. Wyman's eyes, tired and old as iron bands, did not look away. "Whichever hurts you more." The first market day was a tangle of noise and hope. A sisterman traded a clutch of smoked fish for a cask of Northman's beer and declared the beer a sin against grain, and then went away happy with it. A woman from the gift brought apples wrinkled as old faces and sold every one. A septon in a patched robe stood under a makeshift awning and sang a prayer that had words for both the Father and the nameless gods, and afterward drank with a crannogman who could not have told him what temple meant. A man from Skagos in a rough gray cloak that might have been a sail walked through the crowd with a shag of hair that hid his eyes and left a curving horn in Davos's hand. "For your stew," he said. Davos turned it in his fingers, felt the old fat and salt, and believed this horn had tasted whale breath. Children ran through the crowd in a pack like wolflings. Mira chased them once and taught them to paddle a skinboat with a willow branch and laughed when they fell in and came up spitting marsh and proud. Ghost moved among people like a winter wind. Men stepped out of his way and then tried not to be embarrassed they had. A boy called from the end of a plank that a singer had come, and everyone turned to look, and were disappointed, because it was only a thin-faced girl in a patched cloak with hair darker than the marsh water where it goes deep, standing with a wooden flute. She played anyhow, and the marsh grew quiet in a way that made Jon turn and listen. The song did not belong to any tower, nor to any hall south of this fog, and yet it knew every step he had taken from a boy to this strange, stubborn thing he was doing now. He looked for Sansa and found her listening too, her lashes wet and her mouth set in such a line that if you touched it, it might break into something like grief. When he turned back, the singer was gone. Mira shrugged. "Marsh," she said. "It likes to borrow voices." The port's third month brought more coin and more trouble. The fry with the missing finger died, and no one grieved over much except for one man who had drunk with him too many times to remember which stories were lies. A sister man was found by morning with his pockets empty, and his head full of a lump that had not been there when he went to piss. A crannogman disappeared and turned up a day later smiling and with eel eggs in his hair, and no one could tell if that had been his intention or not. A harrow of the Ironborn tried to carry off a Manderley girl, and 3 reeds slid under his boat in the night, and later he told everyone who would listen that the marsh had a hand that squeezed men where it hurt and he would not be coming back. The Manderleys and the reeds did not smile at that. Jon fined the Ironborn who had drunk with a harrow and not stopped him a quarter of what was in their boat. Davos made them pay in coin so they wouldn't be fools enough to bring goods up again with blood on them. "They will test you," Tycho said, approving, when he stood in the doorway with his ledger and watched it be written into. "They will test you for as long as they can afford to, and the ones who cannot afford to will test you twice as much." "I will break before the marsh does," Jon said. "You will not," Tycho said. "You are carved out of rules and oaths and need. That is harder than stone." Jon did not feel like stone. He felt like a rope that has had too much weight on it too long. He slept less well and woke with the thing behind the fog in his head again. He began to hear the marsh the way Howland did. The tiny glug of a channel pretending to be a puddle, the dangerous stillness that meant the bottom was waiting to kiss a keel, the small contempt of water for men who walked on it instead of swimming. What came next had the stink of men more than bog. Wyman's men caught a sack of grain that had been cut with ground shell. A load of tar meant for caulking arrived thin so far a child could drink it by mistake and die. The lock's windlasses were knifed in the night so ropes ran like eels through palms, and men dropped into the water screaming that their hands were on fire. Jon's jaw pulled tight enough to creak. He summoned all the circle in the long hall that looked east over the channel. Manderley's man, who had a face like a ledger that had learned to scowl. Glover, who talked as if he were hitting nails always. Lyanna Mormont, who could, by looking, make a man put down a cudge. Tormund Giantsbane, who had appointed himself the voice of the free folk and was enjoying the hell out of being asked to sit. Howland Reed, as quiet as duckweed and 10 times as impossible to brush away. Sansa, who did not sit on the circle but sat at Jon's right as if men might forget she was there otherwise. Davos stood behind Jon's left shoulder, because he still trusted his left shoulder most. Tycho had the ledger before him and 2 pages pinned with stones as if the numbers might climb out and run. "We have rats," Jon said. "We have Freys," Glover said. "Same thing," Tormund said. And the room laughed until Lyanna Mormont's mouth didn't. Then it stopped. "We have men who are frightened of losing coin," Sansa said. "We must make them more frightened of losing face." "How?" Manderley's man asked. He had the name Marlin and the shoulders of 10 men and the patience of 1. "They have no face to lose. It was flayed off at the twins." "Then give them one," Sansa said. "Find someone brave to wear it and knock it off. If someone is trying to make this port a failure by small wounds, someone is not brave. Bold men make big mistakes. Cowards gnaw. We'll bait them with a chance to do a very brave thing." "You want to leave something where they can take it," Davos said, following faster than any. "But something that tells us where their hole is when they drag it home." Sansa smiled at him as if he had said her thought aloud. "A cask of gold dragons," she said. "Paint it with whitewash and call it candlefish oil. Send it with a boy who sings too much and a guard who drinks too loud. Someone will try. Then we follow the coin," Tycho said, coolly admiring. "I have men who can smell gold out of a charnel house." "We don't need Braavosi men," Tormund said. "Let the marsh smell it. It already does." Howland Reed's voice slid into the room like fog. "We will draw them to a path that dead ends the way a snake eats its own tail. It will make them bold." "The bold die quiet out here." Glover scowled deep enough to be a fisher. "You are telling me we will sit and be gnawed?" "We will sit and let them bite their tongues off," Sansa said. "And we will use that to call a bold man to be hanged." They did it her way. A painted cask of candlefish oil, sloshed with gold that was not one whit lighter than gold always is. The boy who sang too much sang, and the guard who drank too loud drank. They went along the brush road men were meant to go along, and then they took the turn a clever thief would think was his own idea. The cask went up on a cart pulled by a black goat because horses hated the neck, and the goat chewed nonchalantly on the world while pretending to move its legs when someone pulled its harness. Somewhere in the fog, someone laughed a laugh you only hear when men are about to be very stupid. They took the bait. The marsh watched with the blank interest of deep water. The goat did not care. The boy sang. The cask went. Men followed it as if they had led it. By evening a circle of reeds had closed around a bent willow and 5 men were on their knees with their hands behind their heads. And one of them was a fry in a hat that thought it was clever. He had a name like a cough. The room learned it and forgot it and remembered only the way his mouth curled when he said he had not known what was in the cask. He had been told it was oil, he said. He had been told to take it downriver to a place where a certain man would pay. He did not know who, and that was all. He looked around for sympathy and found Lyanna Mormont's face. He looked down again. "We hang thieves," Jon said. He had not wanted to be the man who says such things casually. It turned out the winter had taught him too well. "But I want the man who paid you." The fry told them a name at last when Davos leaned forward and said something quiet about tides. The name belonged to a man no one thought about while awake but remembered in the night. The kind who had survived this long by never being brave. He had been a friend to the Boltons and had sent men with the wrong messages to the right places when needed and shared salt with slavers and pious men alike. He had a face like a second thumb and a house no one ever found on the first try. He had come because he liked eating coin and this looked like a feast. He had most recently been seen at the Sisters. "Let me go," Asha said when she heard, with a grin that made it clear her blood had warmed. "Let me take a boat that swims like an eel and set my men to crawling like lobsters." We will make your rat blink. What will you do when you find him? Sansa asked, mild. We will ask him to pay. If he does not, we will take his teeth, Asha said, and give them to you. Bring him here, Jon said. Asha rolled her eyes. Your rules, she said. I suppose they are good for something after all. They sent a long, low boat out by night, crewed by Ironborn who could scrape a keel on a stone and not curse loudly enough to wake the fog. Asha brought the man back not by his hair, because she had too much dignity for that, but by the front of his shirt. He had the look of a man who has just discovered that cowardice has its own brand of bravery. Desperation. Jon had him stand in the hall with his wrists tied, and every empty place in Jon's sleep filled up with what he felt then. He wanted to be done with men like that. He wanted not to be a judge, not to be a law. He wanted to send the man north and say, the wall knows you. But he had taken that choice away from himself by his own hand. He had rooms to build, and games to play with men who had no rooms and no games and did not care whom their hunger hurt. He looked at Tycho, who blinked with careful blankness. He looked at Davos, who shrugged as if to say, hang him if you must, boy, and if you do, go and eat afterward, because that is what men do who mean to live. He looked at Howland, who did not look back. He looked at Sansa, who met his gaze without flinching. Hang him, she said. Hang him with the charter behind you. The first bold man must die. He nodded. He had thought he would feel something like bone moving under a wound that had closed poorly. Instead he felt tired. Men came and went beneath the pulleys, the rope going up and the man going up with it and the air going out of him and the air going out of the room, and somewhere a child cried and then was hushed by a hand that had no right to be as gentle as it was. Jon looked at the charter until it blurred. He thought about the marsh and whether it approved. That night the fog turned luminous. It came off the water with a whistle like a kettle ready to boil. Men woke to the smell of rot and something that was not rot. The marsh was burning. It did not burn as wood burns, loud and bright. It burned like a wound, seeping fire. Black smoke lay heavy. The water itself seemed to flame. Torches could not find the enemy through it. Shouts came from everywhere and nowhere. A man would answer and find he had called back to his own echo. Jon ran by sound and the dim outlines of men with blankets who went to smother spots of flame and then cursed as the blankets caught too. This is not water fire, Davos panted, eyes streaming. It is gas. It comes out of the mud and waits for a fool's spark. Who lit it? Jon demanded. The fool, Mira said through a scarf wrapped over her mouth. Or 3 fools. It doesn't matter. Put it out. Push mud over it. Make it remember it is mud. They did, on their knees, their hands black to the elbows, coughing until they brought up spit as thick as tar. It went down slowly, stubborn. The air cleared as if someone had cut a hole in a curtain. Dawn decided to arrive anyway. They stood black and coughing and looked at one another with the ridiculous triumph of men who survive their own mistakes. Then the arrows started. They came out of the fog with a hiss like insects. Men went down with a kind of thanks in their faces. The Ironborn had decided they did not need fire if they had patience. They had set longbows in little skiffs and paddled quietly up the channels that had taken years to learn and minutes to be told by a man with a second thumb for a face. Ghost moved without thought. Jon's body followed him. There are times when a man is his wolf, and this was one. He did not think about orders. He went to the bend he would have attacked from and was in time to see the skiff slide out with 3 men bent on their work. He did not call a challenge. He did not threaten. He put a shaft into the man with the bow. He put another into the man who had thought to light another brand and then had the idiocy to try for it when the marsh still smoked. The 3rd man ducked and came up with a dagger and found Mira's arrow point a finger breadth from his eye. Don't, she advised. He did not. On the other side, Asha's crew had made an error, forgotten that the marsh hates everyone equally. Their skiff guided into a pocket of thick scum, clung like shame. They cursed and the words came back to them. The Ironborn archers took their chance, and men whose lives had been saved by the sea before died in a pool you could throw a stone across. Asha screamed something in the language of iron, and it sounded like a prayer to a patient god who had decided to answer now. The fight that day had no grand beginning and no end. It was a gnawing, like Sansa had said of cowards. Men were wounded, slept, woke because they were in pain, fought again. The fire smoldered all day, sour with smoke that scalded the nose. The reed beds whispered and Jon thought he heard words in them. Not language, the presence of other voices who remembered other fights. He did what he could. He put men on the locks with shields. He sent Mira and 2 other crannogmen to lead the enemy into dead ends that smelled seductively of deep water. He told Davos to set casks where men could trip and use them for cover, and told himself afterwards that he had planned it and not invented it while running. By nightfall the arrows slowed. Mira came back with her hair singed where the marsh had insisted on almost making a point. Asha dragged a man into the hall who had an iron-born beard and a northern cloak and looked proud of both. "You're Rat," she said. "Not the Thumb Man. Another. Paid by a fry whose name would make you yawn. Paid by a Manderley cousin who has 10 quarrels with 10 uncles." Manderley's man, Marlin, flinched and then let his shoulders settle. "We'll give you the quarreling cousin," he told Jon. "But first let me strike him." "No," Jon said. "You will not soil your hand on him now. It will make him think he mattered more than gold did." He did not. The cousin went to the rope like the other had. Sansa saw to it that the charter was behind Jon's shoulder again. Tycho wrote something in a margin. Asha leaned against a post and looked at the ceiling until it was done. "Your rules are good," she said afterwards. "They make men angry because they are simple. The more a rule needs words, the worse it is." "That is what judges use for stew," Davos murmured. "They make it thin so they can sell more bowls." "Your stew is thick enough to stand a spoon up," Asha said. "Keep it so." They lit a beacon of their own that night, honest fire in a basket atop a spar. It sent a steady orange down the channel. The marsh looked back with a gaze that did not blink, and Jon thanked it as if it were a thing that minded thanks. Mira laughed at him and told him to keep thanking it. The marsh liked being spoken to even when it didn't answer. Winter's heart rode the months. The neck froze where it never froze and did not freeze where men expected it to. Ice formed like lace in the reeds and then cracked where the channels held. They broke ice with poles and cursed the way men always curse weather, as if it had chosen a side in a dispute and not been itself from the dawn. The port kept Oing like a heart with a murmur. Men came to trade because they liked being warm. They liked rules you could see. They liked the idea of a place that did not ask whose man you were before it let you set your bundle down. White Harbor's ships came when the tides were kind. Sistermen came and swore and paid and tried to steal and paid again. A group of Ibonese took to sitting regularly by the long hearth. Their eyebrows rhymed with frost that did not melt until they laughed, which they did seldom and sincerely. A Bravosi captain with a feather in his hat that confused crows taught the free folk to sing a song that had no tune, and everyone sang it anyway because the words were about not dying yet. And men loved that chorus. Jon slept fitfully and dreamed of drowning less often. When he woke, he would look at the charters and the books and the fine Tycho had levied yesterday and the way the road would sink if they loaded it with too many barrels at once, and think that this was better than killing a king and worse than hiding in a tower and easier than being a boy and more impossible than all of it. Ghost lay with his head over Jon's foot and his breath warmed Jon's ankle. That was enough often to let him go on being a man when being a harbor felt like too much. In a season that might have been spring in some land that had earned it, a traveler came from White Harbor with carved bone combs for trade and a rumor that ran ahead of him like a dog. Wyman Manderley's granddaughter, Winifred, would come to look on the port and see if it was a place a Manderley could pretend to feel at home. The rumor landed in men's ears with a sigh of curiosity and in women's with a flicker of amusement. Sansa heard it and said nothing and watched. Winifred came on a flat barge with banners furled because the marsh laughed at banners. She stepped onto the plank with a grace that had learned to respect mud. She was tall and fair and had a look that could become kindness easily. She made a neat curtsy and then put her hand out to Jon like a tradesman who knows the value of palm and grip. "My lord," she said, and did not call him king. "My lady," he returned, and did not ask if she had come to find her face in the charter. She walked the docks with a scribe that looked perpetually as though he'd mislaid his glasses and a list of questions that made men blink because they were the sort nobody asked. How many barrels could the lock take if the wind turned? Who cut the reeds and how often? Where were the pike most likely to be caught? Which families among the free folk had taken to boat work quickest? Why was the first dock a half-hand wider than the second? Davos answered her happily. Tycho answered her carefully. Mira answered her with laughter. Howland Reed watched her with a quiet that might have been approval. Sansa walked with them and let Winifred ask questions and made the answers mean something more. The marsh stayed itself and did not try to impress anyone. That night Winifred sat at the long table in the hall and listened to a crannogman sing an old song that hadn't been sung loud in 200 years. There was a verse in it about a woman who married a river and drowned and did not mind. Winifred's eyes glinted and she laughed softly when it would have been rude to laugh loud. "Do you love it?" Sansa murmured later when they stood by the lock gate to feel the water's muscle. The night was black and seemed to have narrowed itself to their breath. "I love the idea," Winifred said. "I will love the port when it is ugly and useful enough to have outlasted men trying to make it clever." "It will be that," Sansa said. "He will make it that." Her chin jerked in the way it did when she nodded without wanting to say she was nodding toward a man who stubbornly refused to be anything but himself. "He is better at making rules than he should be." Winifred gave her a sidelong look that had teasing in it. "You love him." Sansa's mouth firmed. "I love the North," she said. "He makes it possible to love the North without hating other things." "That is a kind of loving," Winifred said, and did not press. If she had, Sansa would not have told her fever or denial. She would have said that Jon's hair looked like a storm when he took his hood off and that he listened like a carpenter listens to wood. She would not have said that the marsh liked him, which was a thing she had learned to call love in a place that did not have time for poetry. The phrase came again, less certain. The sisters came, more certain. A caravan from the Vale came with goods on sleighs pulled by oxen that did not complain as loudly as horses since oxen understand mud. They brought cheese that oozed and knives with fancy handles and too many songs about gulls. They brought gossip that Littlefinger had been seen glancing toward the bite and counting sums not his. Jon listened and let it be a wind that slid past the ears of those who needed to know. There were weddings in the port. Small ones with reeds woven in the bride's hair whether she liked reeds or not because that was the fee the marsh took for letting us be foolish, and larger ones when men who had never thought to have a wife learned that you could promise anything to a woman if your house did not sink into the mud before morning. There were funerals quiet as fog. There was a row when a septon said a word too loud about trees and a crannogman told him to put his mouth under water and see if his gods cared what tone he used then. And afterwards a brotherhood of the brush began that held meetings under a willow and tried to persuade septons to stop pretending they were surprised when other men had gods. Sansa made a festival because men work harder when they are promised a day to spend their coin and pretend they are someone else for a little while. Jon grumbled and then set his back to building the thing that would make men pretend they were not seeking war. Place to laugh. They hung rush mats and strung fishnet with tin stars and found a singer whose voice made the marsh tilt its head. Sansa oversaw the distillation of a drink a sisterman had showed her that tasted like apples and regret and made men tender enough to cry and laugh about it. Asha drank it and shook her head and drank more. During the festival, the marsh took back 2 men who had been too bold and had not learned to lean their weight carefully. No one made speeches. Mira whispered something into the fog that might have been an apology or might have been scolding the water for bad manners. The night went on. Jon watched men pretend to be different men for a handful of hours and thought that this was why laws were useful. So men could survive their pretending. He did not expect the knife. He should have. The man came through the press with a face that belonged to no one and emotion that belonged to men who have come to do one thing. Tormund saw him at the same time as Ghost. The wolf went through a sisterman and a barrel of something that splashed onto a man who thought he deserved better. The man with the knife got 1 step closer. Jon moved and Longclaw moved with him, and the knife met Valyrian steel with a sound like a lie finding a truth. The knife snapped. The man cursed in a Riverlands accent he had forgotten to flatten. Someone hit him from behind with a club that had been meant to only look as if it might be used. He went down under feet quicker than Jon could tell them not to. The room breathed out. Jon's heart did not slow for a long time. He knelt and lifted the knife shard and put it on the table and looked to Sansa. She nodded on a slow pivot that said she had expected this sooner. Tycho wrote 2 lines in his ledger with a quill that had survived worse. "Assassins in a free port," he said. "It was always going to be charming." "Charming is not the word," Winifred said dryly, but her eyes were bright as if she had just learned something about the cost of building anything worth having. Ghost put his head under John's hand and shook marsh water into John's face. John rubbed the wolf's ear and thought that there are men who would rather see the marsh eat us than see us make a thing together. That was not a thing he could fight with a single sword. It was a thing he must fight every day with what he had chosen to build. He slept that night with the harbor's breath under his bed and dreamt less of drowning and more of men stacking boxes carefully. The next week was building and ledgering and settling small, domestic wars. He had thought swords would be the worst of it. He had never spent a whole day deciding how much a man should pay in coin to sit a barrel on someone else's plank. He never decided unwisely, if he could help it. Sometimes he laughed about that with Sansa very late and very tired, and sometimes he did not. He learned where to put a plank so women would not catch their skirts on it. He learned not to build a place for men to piss where a wind would make everyone else know about it. He learned not to make the rules so pretty that men could not be expected to follow them. A letter came in Howland Reed's hand that was hardly a letter and meant more. Reed charm twined in twine, a wooden carving of a frog with one eye, a smear of green on a scrap of hide meaning. Old ghosts are stirring on Greywater. John set it on a shelf as you set a memory and touched it when he walked by. He did not ask for more. Howland would tell him if telling mattered. A boy with a face like a rush and hands like twigs arrived from a farm just north with a tail that a white mare had folded done with black legs. John gave him a silver and told him to take it to his mother and tell her he'd stolen it if he wanted to feel like a man. The boy's grin made him lighter all day. That night he dreamed of horses running through the marsh and did not drown. Summer, or what passed for summer these days, which was like a man remembering a song he'd only half liked, brought gnats and men's tempers snapped. He settled 6 fights in an hour and fined men for sweating too loudly in a way that made them laugh. He cut ribbon with a sword to open a new warehouse and then went and helped a lad set beams for the next. He held a baby because the mother had to scratch at a rash that would have made a saint swear, and the baby shut up when he put his finger in its fists. Ghost watched the finger jealously. The phrase stopped coming with knives and started coming with peddlers who had honest need and less appetite for knives. The sisters brought rumors that a lord in the Vale had sold a cargo twice, and that a ship in Gulltown had lost its rudder and had to be steered by men with paddles like children, and that all their children were better at paddling. Asha took the best of those rumors and sailed around the sisters and returned with a boat full of seals. She told this story. She had found 3 slavers arriving by night and tied their ship to a stone without their consent. And when the slavers woke and found themselves not moving, they had pretended to be honest until she asked what their cargo had been yesterday, and they could not invent as quick as her men. She delivered the slavers to John with a piece of their rope still on the leader's wrist. "You take my rope," she said cheerfully. "Your rules take their money." "Agreed," John said, and the slavers went to the rope because rules are like stew. The more you use them, the thicker they get. John went to the heart tree 3 miles north and sat with his back to it and told it what he had done. The weirwood did not answer. Ghost slept with his head on John's knee and snored lightly through his wolf nose. John thought briefly of a dead man who had worn a king's name like iron and died in snow, and of a dark girl with eyes too old for her face who had played a flute and then vanished, and of Sansa in lantern light making a board of rules sound like a story told to children. Ash! He thought of his father, both of them, who had both thought building was made of killing. He thought that they had been wrong in a way that had been too expensive for him to admit until now. He went back and built. Autumn came and the marsh put on its copper shawl and sighed. The port breathed like a chest that had learned to be patient with itself. On a day when swans moved through a channel ghostly as ladies and men looked up from what they were doing and smiled for no reason, a horse came along the causeway, blowing steam, its rider a woman who wore her hair in a braid that could have been a lash. Arya did not take off her hood when she came into the great hall. She did not say her name. She looked at the charter and read it as if it were a strange animal. She looked at Davos and smiled because he had always had a kindness about him. She stood with her back to a post and waited until Jon turned, and then she pushed back her hood and looked exactly as he had dreamed she would, and not at all. For a heartbeat they were children again. Then Ghost was between them, wriggling in the particular shame of a wolf who wishes he could be in two places at once. Arya knelt and put her arm around his neck and said something fierce into his fur. Men looked away because they understood. They talked in the quiet behind the wharf, among the ropes that smelled of salt and men. Arya spoke as if she were describing things that had happened to other people because that was the only way she could. Retellings cut out the worst of it. He knew that trick. He did not ask about the list. She looked at him and said, "You look tired." And he laughed because everything in the world felt less alone at that moment. "Do you love this?" she asked him as they watched men roll barrels along planks with care that looked like affection. "It is as murderous as any blade," he said. "But it kills colder." She smiled. "That sounds like trade." "It is law," he said. "It is building. It is telling men we can all do a thing if we tie ourselves to a rule that is bigger than we are." "Sounds like a game a Southerner would like," she said. But there was no contempt in it. Only the old wild in her that liked to catch and be caught on her own terms. "I like it because it makes ghosts jealous." She didn't stay long. She hadn't stayed anywhere long in years. Sansa kissed her cheeks and did not ask where she would sleep that night. Mira showed her how to gut an eel so that a child would eat it without crying. Arya learned and then slipped away and left a coin behind on a post the way men do when they keep a chair for someone. Ghost sniffed the coin and sneezed. Jon kept it in a drawer with the reed charm and the wooden frog and the smell of the marsh in his head. The year turned. The port grew ugly. It was a good ugliness. The first black crust of tar on a piling that does not flake off at the touch is a better beauty to a shipman than carven pillars. The barked knuckles of a lad who has learned to set a rope without looking are the kind of miracle that deserves prayers and are the only miracle you can reasonably expect to work in weather. The ledger lines grew thick with numbers that had more weight than words ever do. Tycho smiled once and said a Braavosi word that meant both clean and honest and satisfactory. Sansa made a second festival, and this time men drank just as much and did not set anything on fire except what was meant to be lit. Asha took a Braavosi trader and a sisterman fisherman and made them play a game that involved bones and lies. And when she won, she took a boat and went to raid a man who had stolen from the charter and came back laughing. Winifred returned and brought with her an old shipwright with hands like wood and a sense of humor dry as the bone of a cod. He taught 3 marsh lads to make pegs that did not chew out of holes and told them they'd be shipwrights if they learned to swear in 3 tongues. He taught Jon where to put a post so that a fight did not become a riot and what thickness to make a door so men would think twice before breaking it. Jon sat often with Sansa and looked over the whole thing as if it had been a board to play Sivas on and they might make new rules just for the joy of it. He told her that men must be fined if they scraped their paddles on the lock gate, and she said men must be forgiven once if they apologize because forgiveness is another form of coin the poor understand the value of better than the rich. He told her that they should build a second road to the north, and she said they should wait and build the hospital first, because men remember who bandages their children. He said, "Hospital?" And she said, "You make rules. Someone must mend the men you break with them." He kissed her brow because he had never thought of that, and she allowed it because he had. Winter found them again with the honesty that no one likes. The ice came earlier and cracked stranger. Men fell through and were hauled out and did not always live. The marsh burned once more and they put it out quicker because they had learned the marsh's breath and how to push mud into fire. The Ironborn raided twice and were beaten twice, and the third time they came and traded, and Asha looked amused to be losing the argument she had promised to lose. The sisters came with boats full of salt and driftwood and songs filthy enough to make even Tormund blush, and left with coin and no more dignity than they had arrived with. The Wolf's Den sent word that the Grey Council of White Harbor had codified the laws of the free port and had published them for sailors to read at the fish gate. 8 rules, simple enough to sing as a jest. Sansa tried the song. It was better as a jest. Davos declared it the best legal hymn he'd heard. Tycho paid a scribe to copy the 8 rules in a hand so clean even men who could not read would admire it. In all this, Jon did what he had been doing since he'd shaken the fog off the first day. He made choices and tried to make the next one better than the last. He gave a sister man a second chance because his hands had been shaking with cold when he lied and because everyone deserves to be taught the difference between a mistake and a plan. He banned a Bravosi shipman for a year because he'd thought it clever to be clever. He told a free folk spearwife that she could not bring her spear to the market because rules are for everyone, and listened to her tell him what rules had done to her and let her bring a knife instead and called it a compromise, which is a word as ugly and useful as the port had become. He went to the heart tree and talked sometimes until dawn and got no answer except the stillness in his own head that told him the answers were not going to come from anyone but him. On a night when the wind had claws, Howland Reed came to him with a gift. It was a rolled hide with marks on it that were not quite ink and not quite blood and not quite something Jon had words for. It was a map of the marsh as the marsh knows itself. Howland did not explain how he had made it. Jon did not ask. He put the hide on the table and weighted its corners with stones and traced the path of a channel that had not existed last week and would exist again next month. He felt a gratitude so deep it embarrassed him. "You will leave this to someone," Howland said. "That is the work. Not making men say your name. Making sure they can say their own when you are not here to hear it." "I am here," Jon said. "For now." Howland's eyes had pity in them. "We are not made for forever. Even trees die. The first men built this place and named it for what it was. A moat, not a keep. Remember, what we keep now is not the stones. It is the crossing." Jon thought of the crossing then, not of armies, but of things men moved when they were tired. Barrels, bundles, babies, griefs. He thought of laws as a crossing that kept men from drowning while they carried their burdens. He thought that was almost enough to be proud of. "You have built a thing as mad as any story," Howland said. "If you were a singer, you would make it more beautiful and less true. You are not a singer." "No," Jon said. "I am a boy who said yes to too many things and found out I could be a man if I did them. Sometimes the only way to learn to swim is by drowning," Howland said and laughed. And it turned into a cough that might have been a sob and might have been a reed's sound on a winter day. The spring that followed. Spring because there were green things again, because a child laughed in a new way and a woman planted something she did not plan to eat immediately, because men stopped keeping their cloaks on in the hall, was gentler than they deserved. The port stood. The locks worked. The charters had their thumbprints. Men were proud of having done a thing no one had ever done where no one had expected them to do it. They had made a free place out of a place that had only known choke. Jon stood on the tower stump where he had stood that first morning and looked at what lay below. It was small. It was ugly. It was a chaos that could only be loved by those who had survived its making. It gleamed in places where water takes the light and gives it back begrudgingly. Its voices braided, arguments and laughter and a boy crying because he had fallen and his mother saying he was brave whether he believed her or not. He felt something ease in him that had been clenched since he was old enough to know what his name meant. He breathed in the smell of tar and water and river and thought, "I made this possible." He did not think, "I did this." Men who think that end up dead under their own banners. Sansa came to stand beside him. She wore no cloak because she wanted to feel this wind. Her hair caught it like cloth. She looked at the port with an expression that was too complicated to be called pride. She touched his hand once, quick and proper. "You know," she said, "when I was a girl I thought the best thing a hall could be was clean." "It is not," he said. He had learned that with a joy that embarrassed him. "The best thing is full." "It is." She leaned on the parapet like a man who has never learned to be a lady and did not care. "Do you think Father would have loved this?" He thought of Eddard Stark, who had loved what was proper and solid and men who kept their oaths, and of Rhaegar Targaryen, who had loved songs too much. He thought of the old gods and the way they accepted sacrifice so calmly, as if they were teaching you to be calm about your own eventual giving. He thought that both his fathers might have loved this and might not have understood that love in themselves. He thought that that was what growing up was, learning to love what your fathers could not imagine without apologizing for it. "Yes," he said. He would have loved the rules. "And the ugliness?" she asked. He smiled. Mother would have loved the ugliness. He did not say which mother. He let both ghosts share the joke. Below, Davos was teaching a boy how to coil a rope so it doesn't snarl. Tycho was closing a ledger. Mira had a child on her shoulders and was walking in water up to her thighs because the child had wanted to see the marsh from where it could see her. Howland Reed was nowhere and everywhere. Asha was setting out with a boat full of something she would lie about until she had sold it twice and paid her tithe in laughs. Winifred was speaking with a mason about an angle that would not make a man stumble at dusk. Lina Mormont was telling a grown man to stop picking his teeth with a nail. The sister men were arguing about gulls. The Ibanese were sitting with their eyebrows icing and murmuring something that was probably kind. Jon turned to Sansa. "Hunger is the enemy we beat this year," he said. "Next year it will be something else. And we will beat it if we count well and are stubborn and kinder than we want to be. Kindness is a sea." "Oin," she said. "And a weapon," he said. "And a rule," she said. He smiled. "You have learned too much from Tycho and Davos." "I have learned too much from you," she said, and did not take it back when he looked at her. They stood until the fog began to rise again, as it always did at evening. Ghost sat with his nose to the wind, and Jon could not decide if the wolf was counting all the smells or choosing which ones mattered. He put his hand on Ghost's head and felt the strength there and the acceptance. He looked down at the free port that was his and everyone's, and the marshes and the old gods and the sisters and the Ironborns and the Bravosies and the children's and the hungers that would never truly be sated. He felt melancholy and contentment exchange places in his chest like men moving past one another politely in a narrow hall. He thought that was about as close to happiness as he would let himself have. Later, when the hall was noisy with the noise he had learned to consider holy, he took up the charter board, heavy now with amendments men had argued for and won, and read it aloud to a new captain who had come in tired and weary. He read it in a voice that had learned to be a law's voice. He said the words about no slavers. He said the words about no stealing. He said the words about fees and fires and forgiveness and second chances and final chances. He looked at the faces around him and saw that they were prepared to be ruled and prepared to argue and prepared to laugh. He looked over their heads and saw Mira make a face at him that said, "You are too solemn again," and he stuck his tongue out slightly at her in the childish way he had not been allowed to be a child. She grinned. The room breathed. When he finished, a sister man shouted, "Does it come with a bowl of stew?" And Davos shouted back, "No, but I'll sell you one." And someone started a song that was too bawdy even for the sisters, and the marsh pretended not to hear, and the night folded itself around them like a damp, kindly hand. Outside, the wind was from the east and cold. The beacon burned oil in clean one-armed flames. A white wolf paced the edge and looked at the black water and saw nothing there that was not itself. The marsh grumbled and settled. The free port slept. In the morning, the men would wake. The rules would still be the rules. The carts would roll. The locks would move with the slow dignity of a thing that had decided to take its time. And somewhere beyond the fog, men who thought they could make their fortune by breaking this would talk themselves into trying, and that would be all right. The charter did not promise that men would not be foolish. It merely taught them what happened after. In the middle of the night, Jon woke and stared into the dark and listened with an ear he had learned here. He heard a creak in the post at the foot of the bed and knew a man had leaned there and shifted his weight. He heard a boat bump something and knew a boy had misjudged. He heard, beneath it, the port's faint breath. He turned his head and saw Sansa asleep in her own bed with a frown on her mouth as if she were making rules in her dreams. He wanted to go stand in the doorway and watch the hall sleep and say to himself that this was good enough. He did not move. Ghost sighed luxuriously and put his paw across Jon's foot, and this made the decision for him. He would stay here and be a man who could trust that a thing he had set going would keep going without him for a night. In the morning, a messenger would bring word of a storm that had snapped a mast, and they would help replace it. In the afternoon, a sister man would be fined half a groat for spitting where the law said men did not spit, and would laugh with pride at being part of a place where the spitting had rules. That evening, Asha would say the port was too clean by half, and Jon would tell her to dirty it up, and she would bark at the thought of being appointed official filth and go and do it anyway. Tycho would show him the numbers, and Jon would nod and not pretend to understand beyond his useful understanding. Mira would come and make him eat and tell him that he had become a tree in his habits, and the marsh wanted to remind him that trees fall over if they think they are laws. And the day after, there would be another day, ugly and good. In years to come, men would tell the story of how a bastard rebuilt a ruin and made it into a free place and forgot he was a bastard while he did it. Not because he called himself a king, but because he decided to be an honest steward of ugly, necessary things. Some would say the marsh loved him. He would have laughed at that. The marsh does not love. It endures and it eats and it allows. That was enough. On a day when swans made a path like a promise and men were, for no good reason, kinder than usual, Jon stood again on the stump with Ghost and watched a ship slide in. The ship's hull wore scars. Its captain looked as if he had mislaid a dozen friends and could remember them all, and he wore his grief like another scarf about his throat. He took off his hat and stood there, face up, eyes closed, as if the sun had something to say to him. Jon did not know him. He did not need to. He watched a man who had come to trust that this place existed. He listened to the port's breath and then to his own. He put his hand on the tower's old stone and felt the weight of blood and the weight of water in it and thought, "We have taught the world some rules that it did not want and will be better for." He smiled, a small thing. The marsh did not see it. A gull cried. Someone dropped something heavy and swore. A child laughed. Men argued about how to tie a knot. The lock opened with a groan like an old man getting out of a chair, and then shut with the satisfaction of that chair welcoming weight again. Jon Snow turned to go down the stair. Ghost rose and padded after him, a white shadow slipping through waterlight. He went to the hall where men were waiting with questions and gripes and coin and a good joke they wanted to tell someone important. He went to the charter board. He went to rules and stew and the extremely complicated business of making a place where men could be a little less hungry and a little less cruel. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Sansa met him with a look that said there were 3 problems and 2 joys and 1 secret she wanted him to guess. He raised an eyebrow. She shook her head. "First the joys," she said. He nodded and let himself be led. Rules can wait for joy if you are wise enough to let them, he had learned. He was becoming wise in small ways. In large ways he was only stubborn, but stubbornness is sometimes wisdom that cannot find the right words. He put his shoulder to the door and felt the texture of the wood he had watched men plane smooth. The hall's warmth picked him up under the ribs. He stepped inside. The marsh breathed outside, unconcerned. The beacon burned. The port stood. The rules hung where all could see them. And the day began again.